Hi all, Dr. Clark here again. And for forest management, this time around we're going to talk about wildlife and forest 2. Now, the reason why I label this 2 is the first part we talked about the role that forests have in dictating wildlife. Like the role that forests have along streams to control temperature, the role that forests have in supplying energy into the system for aquatic invertebrates and terrestrial invertebrates. Um, kind of uh, that role, clean air, clean water role. That's pretty self explanatory. We know how important forests can be for wildlife, for habitat, shelter, etc. But the real question is, or the real piece of the puzzle that I want to talk about this time is what's the reciprocal side? What role do wildlife have in dictating forests or in the forest management and the health of the forest? Okay, so that's where we're going to, kind of go this lecture, and that's the second part of wildlife and forest. Okay, so we remember we know the role that forest plays for wildlife. It provides habitat, shelter, food, clean water, clean air. We've talked about that before, and it's pretty self-explanatory. We understand because even though we don't think of ourselves as wildlife, we are animals, and without forests and without plant material, we're not here, we're not on the planet, we're not alive. So we understand, as humans, we understand that need for um, forest for the benefit of the wildlife. Okay, but what I'm interested again in talking about is, do the forests need the wildlife? Okay, or what role does the wildlife have in forests? Okay. So my argument here, or my information that I'm going to proceed with, is that wildlife for forest management is needed for seed movement. Okay, so here you can see some bear. This is bear scat. Okay, you can see seeds in there. Um, Bears are really good at eating berries, but also eating other seeds and depositing them in different spots, different regions, okay, and that helps with seed movement. But there are, lots of wildlife that move seeds, and in some cases, it's very, very important that wildlife or is there. Otherwise, the seeds would never get moved, and you'd have a lot of competition in the same region. So a plant drops its seeds. If the seeds aren't moved to a new region, all its saplings, all its young trees are just growing at the basically the base of the trunk, and it's competing with its own children or its own genetic offspring. Okay, pollination. We know about pollination. We know the importance of pollination, and I think a lot of pollination questions have been really coming to the forefront with the decline in bee populations. We understand how much we rely on bees and other insects for pollination, but pollination can also happen from other organisms. It's not just necessarily insects. We'll talk about some other ways at which things get pollinated. Okay, population control. Again, you know, uh, wildlife eat forest material. They eat seeds, but they also eat saplings, and that can control, how many individuals you have in a given area. So it's kind of a way of population control. Disease spread. This you might think, well, how could that be good? But disease is actually a very important role in forests, and it's not always a bad thing. and we'll talk about disease spread also. And then what I call nutrient loading. Okay, they bring nutrients from different regions into the forest. Okay, and we'll talk about that role here shortly. Okay, so seed movement, seed dispersal. There's two categories that I like to talk about, and that's active seed movement or seed dispersal, and that's individuals that are eating the material or collecting the material to eat it, and they deposit seeds from that point of view. Like here, you can see, this little rodent is consuming, in this case, consuming berries, but it doesn't have to be berries. It could be, tree material, tree seeds, either like pine seeds or catkins off of another type of tree, or fruiting bodies off of another type of tree. It doesn't really matter. A lot of trees that have fruit, uh, especially sweet fruit, that sweet fruit is there to attract organisms to come and consume it. Okay? So evolutionarily, the fruit itself is sweet. It packs a lot of sugars, and organisms will come consume it. They'll consume the seeds also, but most of the seeds in those fruiting bodies, they have a extra cuticle layer that covers the seed and can resist a lot of stomach acid, and so the seeds are passed through the organism that consumed it, bird, mammal, reptile, whatever it might be. It passes through their gut, their intestines, and out unscathed. So eating it is a definite active method of seed dispersal. The organism itself who's consuming the sweet fleshy body of the fruit probably doesn't know that it's actively depositing seeds, but nonetheless they are. Storage or caching. Okay, this a lot of rodents will do this also. They'll take pine cones or different types of seed material, and they'll cache it in in a burrow or a midden or something like that. And a lot of times those seeds will either be, I don't want to say forgotten about, but maybe they're not needed. Most rodents or small mammals probably don't forget where they cached their food or stored their food. Some may forget, but often it's just they cached plenty or they stored plenty of food and they didn't need it all before the next seed set, so they left it. Well, that material is normally able to germinate, and that's kind of an active method of seed dispersal or seed movement. Passive methods are more in line with the kind of seed itself or seed structure itself, the evolutionary adaptation that the seed has developed, like hooks and spines. Okay, these hooks and spines that occur on seeds, they're the purpose of the hook and spine is actually to hitch a ride on typically a mammal or bird or something like that, and to grasp on to material. And so evolutionary speaking, of course, the seed or the tree or whatever the plant is didn't like come up with this idea, hey, it'd be great to have spines on my seeds because then mammals could pack me. But it was probably a mutation that happened to work. And, that mutation popped up, had a spine, had a hook, and a mammal carried your seed off to a new region. Okay, and that organism grew up producing spines and hooks on their seeds, and it just continues to kind of domino effect until all the seeds of that species have hooks, spines, or sticky material that attach to the coat of mainly mammals, but sometimes birds also. Mud, soil movement. This can just be like in the grooves of paws, things like that. That's more just kind of a really passive situation that doesn't have an evolutionary kind of aspect to it. Um, but the organisms still have the ability to move the seeds. Okay, so hooks, spines, sticky material, that kind of stuff, that really has an evolutionary trend. It's evolved to grab onto the coat, like you can see here. This coat, you can see all kinds of seeds all over this organism, all with hooks, spines, sticky material. Um, and that's all evolutionarily uh, evolved mechanisms, but mud, soil movement, that kind of stuff, not so much. Okay, but seed dispersal really, in my opinion, it can be broken up into active, meaning that the organism actively seeking out that seed, or at least the fleshy body around that seed, and then disperses it. Okay, passive, meaning that the organism is just walking by and collects the seeds and deposits them, um, not because they want to, but because of the mechanisms that are provided by the seed or the situation. Pollination, I think you can break pollination up into similar situations, where whether it's active pollination or passive pollination. Active pollination would be that organism is seeking out probably nectar or some sugary substance that the plant has developed, evolved, to attract pollinators to it. So that's the purpose of the bees, coming to flowers, and hummingbirds coming to flowers, is so they can get nectar, so they can obtain material. And then they'll get it on their head, or they'll get it on the follicles of hair and septa or whatever, and carry it to the next flower. Most people know about active pollination. I'm not going to go into great details about it, but a lot of people don't think too much about the passive pollination. Passive pollination is often, you know, it's not, maybe it's not accounting for a huge amount of pollination, but um, especially in trees where, you don't have that active pollination, the tree is not producing a nectar to attract pollinators, but the tree itself might have a different type of pollination. Maybe it's wind pollinated, you know. So passive can play a huge role. You can have organisms like here you can see these doves, visiting saguaro cactuses. Now, just standing on the flower, they can get pollen stuck on their feet, and then they can transfer that to the next cactus, etc. There is some active pollination that's going on. Bats will pollinate saguaros and things like that, but there's some passive pollination going on also from just the transfer, because you're in that region. You might get pollen on your head. A lot of insectivorous birds will be eating insects that are around flowers and things like that, and they might get pollen on their head, and then they transfer that to another tree, where they might be feeding on insects. And so that's kind of passive pollination. It's not the plants themselves are benefiting from it, but the organism that's moving the pollen from one plant to another is doing so by not gaining anything from it necessarily, but also it's not to the detriment of the organism. So it's kind of a passive technique. Okay, so population control. Obviously, population control can be a negative and a positive. So here you can see this is a new forested. It was a clear cut, and then you can see that all these little white containers are saplings, with guards on them to prevent deer from consuming them. Okay, because deer like to eat, and other ungulates, elk and other ungulates, um, they like to eat saplings. It's rich in nutrients, etc. Easy to chew, easy to digest kind of material. They like to come in and eat. So in new plantings, obviously, we know this and try to prevent that from occurring. From a population control, when it's a natural, or what we call, seed trees or a natural seeding, okay, population control can also occur. You can have prevention of, say, competition. And so saplings and seedlings will often occur at the base of trees. Well, ungulates and other organisms like to consume material in the shelter of a forest. So in a tree habitat, they like to consume saplings and things like that in the shelter wood. So they'll eat these saplings that might be competing with other trees. Um, they'll eat those first. And then, the seeds that might be dropping out into the open regions, because it's open and the ungulate or the herbivore is going to be exposed, they spend less time in those regions consuming material as long as there's predators around. So the population control can be less competition around established trees, and no harvesting of material in open areas, or less harvesting of material in open areas. So you can get this really good dynamic between consuming material and leaving material, as long as the populations of wildlife is pretty sound. Now, you can have high populations of wildlife, so high that you have browse lines. So here you can see these trees are browsed at the height that an ungulate can stand on its hind legs and reach the branches. It's kind of a perfect line because they're all about the same length. Nonetheless, you get this perfectly groomed material. Now, a lot of people don't like this, but there has been some evidence that when your wildlife populations are high enough to create browse lines, that in fact they might be decreasing the severity of wildfires. Now, this is just preliminary data that's out there, but by having the branches off the ground and no branches low, and eating a lot of the material that would be deposited at the bases of the trees, this might prevent severe wildfires. Okay, possibly. And so that's just out there. I'm not saying it is preventing or not. There's just some preliminary data that suggests less severe wildfire fires are occurring where there are heavy populations of ungulates to browse the material, to keep it clean. Okay. Disease spread. Again, as a wildlife manager, often this is a contentious kind of point. As a forest manager, this is a contentious point because your job as a forest manager is to have healthy forests. Well, you have to have a forest there to ensure that it's healthy. Things like pine bark beetles, longhorn beetles, other organisms that might be uh, consuming tree material, a lot of times they'll bring things with them, like funguses, um, or fungi that come with them, that can have uh, a drastic effect on the tree and kill off a lot of trees. So you can see here, this is pine bark beetle um, kill off, and you can see that there's just massive amounts. All the orange trees are dead, or in the process of dying, and then there's some green trees in between. Now, from a ecology or evolutionary ecology aspect, these are very good things. because the susceptible trees are dying. Now, it's highly likely that some of the trees in this region, okay, especially when they're in between a bunch of, dead trees, they probably have been affected, but maybe they're healthy enough, or they have the genetics to resist that or that fungi, or resist that pest that would be coming in to spread that disease. Okay, and so what we've seen is when you have huge disease outbreaks in forests, yes, it's devastating, and it can be basically reduce your entire forest to maybe 10% of what it was once, um, on that landscape. But that 10% is now resistant to that disease outbreak. And so that 10% is best suited for the environment. They come back, their offspring are best suited for the environment, and the healthiness of your forest is much more healthy from a disease, at least in regards to that disease that it's resisting. That's hard for a manager. Okay, when 90% of your forest is dead or dying and it's been removed, as a manager, you have to talk to the public. You have to look at the public and say, hey, yeah, we understand that we have a disease outbreak and we're losing 90% of our forests. Hey, but that being said, you realize that the 10% that remains is going to be healthy and is going to reestablish that forest. Now, it might take 30, 40, 50 years to reestablish that forest, but it will come back, and it will come back more healthy. So disease spread is kind of, that double-edged sword. As a manager, you never like to see it, but you like to see the results or the evolution and the ecology of your forest after the fact. The healthiness of the trees that come back, etc. It also thins out the trees a lot. The disease does. It's just like a human disease or a wildlife disease when it breaks out in populations. If the populations are really dense, then a lot of individuals die, and your forest is the same way. The more dense, compact your forest is, the more trees that are going to be affected and die off. That opens up the area, that spreads out the organisms, and creates, a, a forest that's not too dense, and makes the forest more healthy. Okay, the last piece that I want to talk about is the role of nutrients, or the role that nutrient loading or nutrient cycling has to play, coming from wildlife, and the role that they play in forests. You have to think about a forest, um, that might be a large forest that has old growth trees, or at least large well established trees. And most of you've probably been in forests like this, where the tree canopy is way up there, it's dense. Okay, there's very little vegetation on the ground, mainly nothing, because the light is not penetrating, so you don't have very many uh, annuals or even perennials that would be coming up in the understory to recycle the nutrients. Okay, so those old growth forests, those large forests, well established forests, are often very nutrient deficient, and they have very poor soil from a organic or nutrient point of view. And so the trees will often, basically, in those systems, they'll often starve to death because of the lack of nutrients that the soil provides. One way that you can get this nutrient cycling is the importance of things like predators that might pack material. So in the Pacific Northwest, where there's a lot of old growth forests that occur next to salmon streams, running through old growth forests, that predator prey forest establishment is huge from a nutrient point of view. Forests, the trees might be, getting 50% of their nutrients from rotting fish that are being brought by bears or coyotes or eagles or whatever it might be being brought out of the stream up into a forest habitat so they can decay and the nutrients can be established um, back into the system. Now, you have to realize that a lot of those old growth forests that you have in the Pacific Northwest, they're actually coniferous forests, they're conifers, so they don't drop needles. So, or very rarely do they don't drop all their needles at least. So it's a bigger issue in coniferous forests, um, that nutrient or lack of nutrients, because you're not getting this huge deposit of nutrients every fall with the falling of leaves. You're getting, a little bit of nutrients from some needles that will fall, and that's pretty much it. So your nutrients have to come from outside, and predators bringing in fish and things like that from streams, local streams, bringing them in, and either leaving rotting carcasses or leaving parts of carcasses in the system can help with that nutrient cycling, but also defecation of that material uh, on the landscape can obviously bring huge amounts of nutrients back into forests that are not getting nutrients from their own leaves. Same thing in the Rocky Mountains, where a lot of the trees are coniferous trees. We don't have those salmon runs in the Rocky Mountains, but you have a lot of ungulates that will go consume material in meadows, and then they'll go into the heavy, dense forests, and they'll defecate in those forests, etc., and recycle nutrients. So the role that wildlife plays in that nutrient cycle is huge, especially in forests that are dense, have dense canopies, coniferous forests where they might have very poor nutrients that are coming from the system. Okay, so with that being said, that's part of the role that I want to talk about with wildlife and forests. We know the role that forests play in wildlife management and shelter and food and clean water and clean air, but wildlife reciprocate that to the forest often with nutrient loading or nutrient cycling, with pollination, with seed dispersal, with disease management, population management, growth management. These kind of things can be a big role from a wildlife point of view. Till next time.